Composer Reena Esmail, I'm so happy that we get a chance to talk about the world premiere of Malhaar, a Requiem for Water, which the LA Master Chorale will be performing soon. And I want to start by asking you about something you said in your TEDx Skid Row talk 9 years ago. You said, I'm at the beginning stages of this journey. I might always be at the beginning stages of this journey. So I want to ask you, where do you feel you are today, and what step in that journey does Malhaar, a Requiem for Water represent?
Oh, that's such a good question because I actually agree that I still feel like I'm at the beginning stages of this journey. At that point, when I had given that TEDx, I had just come back from India and I was just trying to figure out, like, how do I bring these two cultures, these two worlds, these two musical languages together. And I was asking that question for the first time in many ways. And it's almost a decade later, and I feel like I'm just asking that question in really new ways. And I think at that point, I was really just kind of throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. And I would take, a certain element from Indian classical music, a certain element from Western classical music, and try to see what would happen when I put them in dialogue with one another. But I think over time, what tends to happen is the more you do that, the more you're almost creating this third space where certain combinations exist and then become kind of fused together in a dialogue or I guess in its own language. And so I found more and more elements of that language, but I also have found more and more places where things need to be brought together. And so, for me, this piece, it feels like a step in a new direction because it's one of the first times that I've written a piece that involves Indian and Western classical musicians together that isn't necessarily on the theme of that involvement. So in this case, I'm kind of thinking of it like, before Berlioz, there was no harp in the orchestra. And so that was maybe considered like, oh, he's bringing this thing from this different place into an orchestral setting. And now we just think of it as, of course, there's harp in an orchestra. And so and he's not necessarily talking about like, oh, this piece is about the harp being in the orchestra, right? So now I'm kind of trying to move into that space where I'm using these two styles of music to tell a story that is so far beyond just what that connection is between those styles of music.
Well, and you said at the beginning of your answer that you're still asking that question. Are you getting different answers now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you mean by asking the question of like how can I bring these cultures together?
Well, and also where you are on your journey. I mean,
Yeah, I find that I'm in different places because also these cultures have people in them, right? They're not just like the disembodied cultures. And every time I come into dialogue with new people, there are new questions. And so, I mean, for instance, since that time, I've come into dialogue with, on one hand, some of the most famous Indian artists of our time, and been so privileged to write for and work with them. And they bring their own context because they've had decades and decades of experience in a particular tradition, and some of them have even had experience crossing over, so you can do really interesting and different things. And then on the other hand, like right now I'm in the Chicago area and I'm working with students, and there are many South Asian students who are wanting to experience their kind of culture of being like me, being South Asian American. And how do I kind of write into that space? Because, that really didn't exist when I was their age and growing up. So I think the question is so based on who the people are who are involved in on either side.
makes sense. Now, just last week on your Facebook page, you posted, "My 2022 is finally over. This is the last bar line of my Requiem, 2 months and two days late, but mercifully I am done." What were the biggest challenges for you in writing Malhar?
Yeah, well, as you said, I mean, the first biggest challenge was just time because 2022 for me, and I think probably for many composers, was that crazy year where everything that was rescheduled into that year from the past couple years of COVID. And then everything that was in 2022 didn't get moved. So basically we were writing 3 years of music on top of one another. And so that was the 16th of 16 commissions that I wrote in 2022. So you can tell my 2022 ended on March 2nd, 2023. But I mean, aside from that, I think the other musical challenges were that It's interesting that I realize I have never written a piece originally for choir and Indian voice at the same time. And so I guess you can say, like, on one level, we all have bodies, we all have certain ranges that our voice can sing in. And so I don't know why I didn't quite realize this before, but the fact that the Hindustani tessitura lies about a fifth below the Western female tessitura is just creates a lot of interesting challenges because of the fact that what key do you set something in? How do you make everyone feel comfortable in their own range? And these are things that I don't think we really think about so much when we're writing for choirs, because of course we know what works well and what works well in each range. And then all of a sudden you throw someone in there who's literally right between the male and the female range. And how do you make all of that work? So that was, I think, one of the particular challenges. The other thing that I ran up against that was so different in this piece, that for the first time, I mean, again, after over a decade of working in this field, what I didn't quite realize is that a lot of times I set Indian classical ragas into Western settings. And in instrumental music, I think somehow the shift over works. But I realize that when you're speaking in English, sometimes it's very hard, or even in Latin, in all honesty, in Western languages, it's very hard to set rag in a way that sounds authentic. And if you kind of look back through the tradition, you'll see it's rarely done. It's mostly people are singing in Indian languages. And there's a reason for that. So things that you would think would be so simple are like, oh, there are notes, they move in a certain way, like you could set them in any language. Definitely not. And I think like that's the reason why, you know, we have Italian vocal music, French vocal music, all those things have evolved to have very different phrase structures and certain things because of what the language gives them. And that is really very much the case in Hindi too.
No doubt. Now, if my research is correct, a Malhar is usually associated with torrential rains.
Yes.
It seems appropriate that you finish this work as Los Angeles was being pelted with torrential rain. Did it strike you as ironic, or was it in any way also inspirational for you?
Both, and that's a great question because, you know, I grew up in LA. So I remember when I first went to college and started meeting people from other places, and I would tell them that we would get rain days, like our school would get canceled if it rained. They were like, that is insane. Like, what is happening? And I didn't quite realize, like, oh my gosh, this doesn't happen in other places because LA just doesn't know how to respond to rain because we get so little of it. And so, I mean, for me, you know, writing this requiem that had to do with water and the disappearance of water is something that goes back to my childhood. It's not just something that's happening now in context of climate change. But what was, of course, really interesting is the minute I started writing, right in January, I was doing this thing where I took a month off just to really work on the scaffolding of the requiem. And the other thing I was doing was hiking. You know, we live in Altadena, and of course, back to these beautiful mountains. And so I was trying to go hiking, and my hikes would just constantly get canceled because it was raining. And then I'm working on this requiem about the disappearance of water. But you know, it's funny because if you see it through traditional Indian eyes, Malhar rags are the rags that are designed to beckon rain. So you're singing this rag hoping that rain will come. And so I'm like, strangely on the spiritual level, I'm thinking, am I somehow beckoning the thing that I am trying to write about the disappearance of? You know, it just it messed with me in all kinds of ways. But at the same time, it is inspiring to me because, again, growing up in LA, rain is so special. And you know, when you recall those sounds or smells or sensory memories from your childhood, to me it was always that my parents had this house up in the Hollywood Hills that has it had this kind of roof where you could really hear the rainfall. And I remember the sound of like waking up in the morning when it was raining those very few times and just feeling like, oh, it's such a special day, you know? And so I feel like it was inspiring in that way to be able to write about the thing that's disappearing as it's coming down, you know, on my own roof.
Well, and I'm in Angelino Heights, which isn't that far from Altadena, and we actually got, a trace amount of snow last week. So I don't know what you got in Altadena, but that's never I'm an LA native. I've never seen that in the city.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because they said that it snowed, I think in 1989 was the last time it snowed before this past time. And unfortunately, I was away. I was so angry that I missed this one day where it snowed. But I remember that snow. I mean, I must have been in elementary school, maybe even in kindergarten or something. And I remember my parents had this lemon tree in their backyard, and I remember seeing the feeling of seeing snow coming down on this lemon tree and thinking like, where am I? This isn't even a real place. This is crazy. So, yeah.
So, since the onslaught of the pandemic, we've been surrounded by loss of all kinds. And I know loss is part of any requiem, and is specifically a part of this one. And environmentally, as you alluded to, we've been challenged and continue to be challenged by water supply issues. How do you go about addressing these issues vis-a-vis your music in a way that is both emotional and intellectual?
Yeah, this I'm so glad you asked this question because to me, I kind of think grief and loss and those emotions are things that we experience viscerally. And, on one hand, I'm looking at the LA Times every day and I'm seeing, okay, now water is being lost in this way. Here are the facts, here are the statistics. And all of this is very important, but none of those things make you feel like, oh my gosh, this is actually something that is deeply emotional and deeply, there's something that really pulls at you emotionally. And I think that we're incentivized to act when we feel that emotional response. And so I thought to myself, what is a way to bring some kind of aesthetic around this that is more than just, well, this is happening, these are the facts, whatever, and to actually connect into our heart space when we're thinking about what to do about this water crisis. And so that was largely why I decided to write this requiem about water, because it's a thing that's in front of us as people who live in Los Angeles. It's in front of us every single day, and yet it's a thing that we just have to tune out because maybe it feels like it's too big to deal with or we can't do anything about it. And it's also a thing that's really scary, right? Because we're terrified that, okay, what's going to happen when we don't have water anymore? Again, growing up in LA, you have this feeling of like, if a tap is running for even 1 second, it makes you so uncomfortable. And I mean, it was really interesting because I was in Montana at this wonderful festival called Tip It Rise in this past August, and they put me up next to this, I guess it was like a stream, or like it was like a small little river thing. And at night, again, I was about to go to sleep, and I'm hearing this river running, and in my back of my mind, I'm like, my God, someone should turn that off. Like that is wasting so much water. And then I thought, no, it's a river, Reena. It's a river. Like, what are you doing? But it's like that's how conditioned I am to that fear response. And so in a way, what I wanted to do is actually connect some of those feelings that I know other Angelinos share about how terrifying it is to lose water, how much we maybe need to grieve all these places we see that are just completely empty, that we know used to have water in them, just the terror of seeing that and the grief of that. And then kind of also saying, I mean, the end of the Requiem is essentially making the point, like, look, water is going on to its next life, right? Water is not just being destroyed. It will find the place that is the best for it. And if we are not making a place that's conducive to it, it will find somewhere else. So like water is going to be fine. It's us that are going to be mourning its loss. So what do we do to actually not have to completely mourn its loss and preserve what we have left?
Classical music has a tradition of writing about water. I mean, we can go back to Handel for obvious reasons. We can also go to Tan Dun, whose water music is extraordinary and one of the finest concerts I think I've ever attended. But I'm wondering, are there different traditions in Indian classical music for addressing water, for addressing rain, in addressing the environment that are different than what we are accustomed to with Western classical music?
Well, I actually think that those Malhar rags are the main rags that have to do with water and the discussion of water. And I think rag for some of the listeners who might not know, it has a lot of aesthetic properties related to it, like in the sense that we have major and minor scales, but aside from just their tonality, a lot of the music that's written in them, the aesthetic decisions are made by the composer. But in this improvised tradition of rag, there's a lot more embedded in the rag itself. So, there are specific phrases, there are specific associations. And so when someone is going to a concert of Indian music, or even frankly hearing Bollywood or something like that, they would have those associations with those specific rags. And so in this case, there's so many different kinds of Malhar. And so, there's one of the famous ones is Mian Ki Malhar, which is kind of the main one. But then there's also Meg Malhar, which is kind of cloud. It's talking about clouds from far away. There's Gord Malhar, there's Sur Malhar. There's even they do combinations of different rags with different things. So some are like the sunlight is coming out through the rain. Some is like they're really, really dense monsoon, like the rain is really coming down. And so all of these things have such specific associations, and then you use those associations to kind of make the point that you want to make, I suppose.
You referenced earlier the idea that Berlioz brought a harp into an orchestra for the first time. And it reminds me that this isn't the first piece you've written around environmental and climate issues. Inconvenient Wounds also addresses these issues and happens to have been written for a harp.
Right.
So, what makes these issues such fertile soil for you and your creativity?
It's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about that, and I think so many composers are thinking about environmental issues now. Certainly not just me, and I think so many artists as well are thinking about it. To me, what feels really important about addressing these issues, other than the fact that we're all kind of staring down the barrel of them, and we're all a little bit terrified, and maybe artists, our way of dealing with it is just to kind of figure out how to process it artistically, is that I really think these are issues that affect us all. And we've come out of a lot of issues that can be so divisive that affect us one way or another. And, they can just be these polarizing issues. And not to say that climate isn't polarizing, it absolutely is. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, if none of us have water, we all need water. And so I wonder whether maybe, and maybe it's just optimism on my part, but that the fact that it affects us all in various ways might help us kind of galvanize our relations with one another, because we do have to work together to continue to live in this world. So I mean, that's what feels uniquely important to me about it. And yeah, it just feels so much bigger than us or our human issues. It's really just an issue of this planet that we live on and how we associate with it.
A vocalist, Siley Oak, is going to be performing with LA Master Chorale when Malhar has its world premiere, and you described her as your soul sister in a Facebook post from November. What makes her unique, and by extension, what makes your collaborations with her that much more unique?
Yeah, Siley is someone who is so dear to me. I started actually studying Hindustani vocal music with her also about, I guess, 9 years ago, 2014. And it was after I'd come back from India, and I had just, I think about 2009 was when I really started studying Indian classical music, and I'd studied with a bunch of teachers. And the last one of those was Lakshmi Shankar, who is Ravi Shankar's sister-in-law. And it was just by amazing fluke that she happened to live in Southern California. And so I would come back to, see my parents on holidays and stuff, and I would take as many lessons with her as I could while I was home. And so my thought was, I'm going to move back to California and I'll study with her kind of regularly. And it was really unfortunate because the last Christmas that I came home before I was going to kind of move back to California, she passed away, and I actually went to her funeral. And for me, it was the loss of her was so great, but then it was just like that was my last connection into Indian classical culture that felt like a real human who I could see and be with. And that was this thing where, when you start to lose the humans that connect you into certain traditions, you just think, well, I mean, I can do this, but it's so different when you're actually having a human relationship. And so I went to Siley just on recommendation of a friend because I knew she was in town and she was teaching. And what started as us just kind of having a few lessons together, we kind of pretty quickly realized would turn into something that was so much greater, because we both shared these values that, she had been trained very much like me. She had had a complete Hindustani training in India, had studied with one of the greatest proponents of Indian classical music, Ashwini Bide Deshpande. And she had moved to this this country. And she was so well trained at what she did and so excellent. And yet she was really creative and like really wanted to try new things. And same with me, right? I've had this very elite training, but I also am so open to kind of working in these different spaces. And it occurred to me at a certain point that, and Siley and I have spent a lot of time with one another's families in one another's childhood places, and I realized, like, if we had just swapped bodies, if we had just been each other and grown up as each other, we likely would have landed up in each other's places because we think very similarly. And so, I mean, basically over the course of this last decade, we've just tried things together, right? You have to find this trusting relationship where you can really begin to ask deep questions, begin to just make mistakes, try things that feel kind of ridiculous, and just really get in there with one another. And over these years, we've built so many pieces just because we're willing to trust each other and we're willing to try something new. And it's been amazing because I remember the first time Siley sang with an orchestra, it was just such a new thing to her. There was so much she was learning. And now it's like when you put her with a conductor, most conductors don't realize that she's not just sight reading music, or that she doesn't, she hasn't had that training, because she's able to respond to things almost as a Western musician would, because she just knows how to cross over in a really beautiful and amazing way. So it's been awesome. And I will say, like, we have all these collaborations, but mostly we're really just deep friends who trust each other with one another's souls.
Which is obviously very important. Also important is the text that you use in a requiem. And I know that one of the inspirations and one of the sources was William O'Daly's Waterways.
Yeah.
And I read some of the poetry that came out of Waterways, and one line stuck with me: the most serene surface of what we no longer remember, who we are, to whom the loon calls across the emptiness. That immediately strikes me as having a musical rhythm to it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what qualities did you find in that poetry, and how much those qualities have in common with what you wanted to write, and vice versa?
Yeah, what is amazing is Bill O'Daly, I met him just purely by accident. I was at a poetry reading of another poet friend of mine who I've done a project with her, Melissa Studdard. She's also an incredible poet. And so she invited me to a reading that she had in LA, and Bill happened to be there, and he was like, "Hey, I had this nice discussion with him." And then I went and looked up his work and realized that he is known for being the English translator of Pablo Neruda. So he has this sense about him that is so lyrical and so incredible. And then, of course, he also writes his own poetry. And so I just started deep diving and deep diving. And when I encountered his poetry, honestly, that was the thing that made me realize that I wanted to write a requiem about water. Because the way that he talks about the disappearance of water, and the way that he talks about it with, because I mean, I should also say, he also works for the California government, and he's one of the lead writers on the California Water Plan. So obviously he knows exactly what he's talking about, but he's also a poet, and that's his, artistic calling. And so he's able to kind of marry those two perspectives of practicality, of understanding what is really happening, and then just putting it in this very poetic voice. And I think, honestly, that was exactly what I wanted to do with water. And so I think his words really enabled me to write this requiem. And I don't know whether I would have taken that step if I hadn't discovered his work. But it's interesting because I set a number of his poems in this piece, and one of them is called Questions for God. And then there's another one, I think, called In Franconia Gorge. And they're a series of questions that really are kind of modeled on that Pablo Neruda Book of Questions type of thing. And I love them because they're so lyrical, and the questions are so open, but they're rhetorical questions, but they're meant to just make you feel like, oh, that is a chasm that has now been opened in my mind that I have to kind of find a way to live into. And I just love that about his writing.
You've been working with Los Angeles Master Chorale for a couple years now. And anybody who attended February 2022's concert would have heard Win the Violin. How much does that piece, for people who might have seen and heard it, prepare people for what they're going to experience with Malhar?
Oh, that's a great question. Because I was actually just thinking about this the other day. So, you know how I was saying like rags have specific associations with them of, time of day and a certain aesthetic. And I think it's interesting because for me, because I work in between these two worlds, sometimes I'm making my own aesthetic connections of like what the rag means, maybe to me looking at it, not even through a Western lens, but through both lenses at the same time. And some I have these rags that I work with over like a long period of time, and many of them are in my work over years and years, and they kind of evolve. And one of those rags is charukeshi. And charukeshi is I won't go into the details of what it is. I wish I had my piano here to play a bit of it for you. But it has this kind of light side and this dark side. And to me, somehow I've always felt it as a way to embody what the feeling is of grief. And I don't know why, because I don't necessarily think that's what the rag is in the traditional Indian setting. But grief is not just this abject sadness. There's so many layers of grief, and I kind of feel like that's what it's come to feel to me. And so and the moment of the lacrimosa, and I've centered that lacrimosa in the piece. So of the seven movements, it's movement four. And there is it's set in charukeshi, but it is set with the lacrimosa text, the Latin text, and then Billow Daly's poem, and I'm forgetting what the name of the poem is, but essentially what he's saying is, um I guess what the Lacrimosa is saying is like, on this day full of tears, we will be judged. And so Lacrimosa is talking about tears. His poetry is essentially saying, well, how do we even grieve or cry without water? Because where are we going to get the water for the tears? And so that is just this moment that I think really kind of connects things in, and connect the grief piece, the water piece, the Latin Requiem piece, and for me, it all came together there. And that is kind of an evolution of my use of Charukeshi, which is again not a Malhar, but it just felt so right to me at that moment. But I think there's so many things from that work. The fact that there are these kind of Indian sounding voices that come in, and in When the Violin, they're from Western musicians. In this case, I've actually kind of put most of the Indian related singing into the Indian voice and tabla player, so that the Western musicians are actually a little bit more in their area of comfort, but that they're able to use that area of comfort to kind of cross into relationship with the Indian musicians.
Now, it seems like every requiem has to have a dies irae component to
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
wondering how, if this piece does, and how you make it fresh after White Lotus chose it as its theme.
Oh, well, so I actually opted not to do the Dies Irae, because I was trying to figure out how to fit that into and specifically the melody of the Dies Irae. I was trying to figure out how to fit that into the Rag Malhar, and I could not figure out how to get it there. So it's interesting because my Latin texts actually are chosen specifically in terms of what I feel like they do for the mourning of water, right? So I've taken out a lot of the things that are very Christian specific, kind of talking there are areas that talk more about spirituality. So there's I do have a Kyrie in there. I do have the Requiem Aeternam movement, obviously, and just anything that's kind of like Lux Aeterna, because I think of this image of like, we think of things descending up to heaven, and in a way what is happening is the water is evaporating. Like that's where the water is kind of going when it gets hot in California. And so it's like it's going on to its next life into the heavens, and we are without it. So it kind of works in that particular way. But I took a lot out about kind of the judgment and all that, because the feeling that I wanted to leave people with wasn't like, you have done a bad, if you do a bad thing you will be judged. I want it to be more like, look, let's just mourn this together, and let's look into the next life.
When we could probably have a very lengthy conversation about whether it's even right to think that religion is going to judge you.
Right. Yes,
I
exactly.
mean, that seems counterintuitive to what religion is meant to be. But
Well,
that's probably man putting himself into, a belief system.
Exactly. Well, and also for me, because I come from a very multi-religious setting, so there's always this element, just like my mother is Catholic, my dad is Muslim, my husband is Hindu. So it's like in my mind, there's just a lot going on and there's a lot to kind of coalesce. And I just kind of try, I think I have a broader sense of spirituality that isn't really based in one religion, even though I was raised Catholic. So honestly, these Latin texts mean a lot to me because I have that association from childhood. But I don't know, I feel like I just kind of look a little bit further afield in my own spiritual practice.
Right. Now, in that same TED talk that I referenced at the start of our conversation, you said, maybe I could use my music as a vehicle to draw together some of the best Western and Indian musicians that I knew, and then create space that allowed them to communicate using their own musical language and still be able to understand one another. And it's that last part, and still be able to understand one another. We're in a society that could use a lot more understanding of one another. How would you like your music to facilitate that understanding, or is it even realistic to expect that music can accomplish that?
You know, it's I'm so glad that you're bringing up that TED Talk because I actually still believe exactly those values that I laid out. And I think I've just had a decade more to live into how it plays out in real life. And I think I believe even more than I did at that point that music can really do that because I've seen it in practice. And so what I find is that when I set up an environment where everyone kind of knows what their part is and can feel confident in being able to do their part well, then they're able to come into a situation where then they can kind of show their best self to the other people that are there. And then those people can actually see who they are. And so sometimes it's like if you're meeting someone for the first time, and especially if you're meeting them in a context where it's a zero sum game, right? Say there's like a budget talks or something like that. It's like there's a winner and a loser on either side of that thing. But when you're meeting them in the context of music, and you're trying to create something beautiful together, and everyone has a really unique part to play, and you can't do it without those people's unique part. But obviously, there's no singer and master chorale that can sing Hindustani music better than Siley. And it's like Siley can't sing choral music better than the people in master chorale. So they're really leaning on each other, and that develops a trusting relationship. And I think that's the thing. If you create a situation where people have a venue to be able to trust one another, then difficult conversations can happen. People can ask questions, things can really open up, but we have to create that trust first. And so there are many ways to do that, but I think as a composer, I think I can create that trust, and that basis where trust can happen in the context of my work. And I will say that I also do control very carefully who are the people who are taking that first step in my pieces, right? Because it's not just like any choir and any Hindustani musician could have had this experience. Master chorale, as you know, is very dear to me. So many of these singers who are singing are people who I have deep personal relationships with, and of course Grant and Jenny and the whole staff. I'm really part of that team, so I took a lot more risks on the choral side because I know who I'm writing for and I know that they're good for it. Whereas I would be a little bit more conservative in my writing if I didn't feel like I knew the ensemble as well. And of course, with Siley, she's been in there from the beginning, and she's actually been even a larger part of the composition process of this piece than she has any time in the past. She's asking all these deep questions, she's getting in there and trying to figure out what's going on. And so I feel like the process of putting it together is going to be so joyful. And so I think this is this thing where in my ideal situation, the first performers that perform the piece also model the relationship for everyone to follow. Because I mean, now we're about 6 years out from the premiere of my oratorio, This Love Between Us, which Yale and Juilliard and some musicians from India all commissioned this, yeah, in 2017, essentially. And so it's interesting now because there's a whole ecosystem for that piece where Western ensembles have to find sitar and tabla players, and I know that there are people that can do it, and I know that like I know how to kind of get it together in a lot of different settings. But it's because those first performers trusted each other so much and actually modeled that makes the continuation of the work and the feeling that you really can build that environment, that multicultural way. It makes it feel that that's even possible. So I think it takes a lot of steps, and I'm committed actually to all those steps. It's not just that I write the music and I'm like, good luck, I'm really in it. And sometimes, even at the beginning, I'll sit with the Indian players. I'll make sure that they feel comfortable on the stage. And of course, I don't think these players will need it because they all know each other so well at this point. But I'm always committed to every single step of the process.
Right. Well, hopefully this will be recorded and then people can get a sense of what it's meant to sound like, because I'm assuming LA Master Chorale will do a great job with it.
I have no doubt. I'm so excited. And in all honesty, it's just it's almost such a relief to work with musicians that I know so well and I trust so much. Because there's always, as a composer, you're often coming into new environments where, of course, people want to be there and their intention is great to do a good job, but you often don't know enough about them until you get far enough into the rehearsal process. But in this case, I'm like, oh, this is going to be totally fun for me. The writing process, really took it out of me, but the process of rehearsing and actually bringing it to life is just going to be so joyful.
Well, I can't wait to see it because I will be there for the concert. I went back and looked at some of the earlier interviews that I've done that I've posted on YouTube. And I went back to the first interview that I did because the person I interviewed, a musician, said the following, which I think is really interesting. Hopefully, what any creative endeavor can accomplish is the ability to create a portal, that mirror or lens of one's attention and time, to be able to give oneself a glimpse to say, you know what? I have the right to create something too. I have a voice. I have something to say. Whether we're going to sit ourselves down and apply ourselves to the craft of creating, manifesting something from that capacity is the work before us. Do you agree? And what resonates with you today on your journey as the work ahead of you?
It's funny because as you were thinking that, I was like, I think I might know the person who said that.
Who might that be?
I've had many discussions like that in the context of my own home, in fact.
Yes, it was your husband who said that.
Exactly. Oh, I know a BJ quote when I hear one. Because I hear them all. I hear them all before anyone else hears them. It's fascinating. He just did a program. And he's the director or he's the artist in residence at Music Worcester this year, and he just did a program called Mirror and Lens. But yeah, no, of course, yes. Clearly,
Well, I had, if I was going to quote somebody, or how many other times do I have an opportunity to quote someone's spouse?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, well, we spent a lot of time talking to each other, obviously. But yeah, no, of course. This idea of art as a portal, and the fact that anyone should be able to express themselves through art, I absolutely agree with that. And I think those were the values that we very much first connected on. In my case, I see that there's this portal that exists between different musical cultures, and we think of them as so separate because the surface of them might seem really different. But in a way, I think of myself as someone who how sometimes you have friends who maybe don't speak the same language or are just in different places in the world, and you think, oh my gosh, if they only had this shared language, they would be best friends with each other. Like, they are so similar. It's just that these few things kind of divide them. And I've thought about that often in between these two cultures, that I am kind of a conduit that I want people to move through, right? And I want, say, someone's performing a string orchestra piece of mine that uses Indian classical music. There will maybe be someone who's like, okay, I'm getting kind of a taste of this through my own lens. I'm getting maybe one version of this improvisation kind of frozen for me so that I can actually learn it in my own instrument, the same way that you would, transcribe a jazz solo or something like that. But then there will always be those musicians in every group who think, let me go further. Let me actually go into Indian classical music itself, and vice versa, from Hindustani and into Western classical music. And to me, like, that is the joy, to see someone actually take the ball, go through that portal, and just run with it until they're on the other side and can make their own connections. So it's like, I think a lot about that and how to facilitate those connections between people so that it's not just me in there all the time. It's like I kind of will introduce people to one another and just let them teach each other their art. And yeah, to me, being that conduit is important, and just feels amazing.
Well, terrific. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too.
And I appreciate your letting me post this on our YouTube channel, which will run several days before the world premiere of Malhaar.
Perfect. Oh, thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Thank you. Enjoy Chicago, and I will see you in a couple weeks.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks, Reena.
Bye.